What if your healing didn't come from a diagnosis or a prescription or a textbook approach? What if it instead came through something deeper and far more personal and powerful? In today's episode, I want to share something deeply personal. It's how I found healing not through conventional therapy, but through my faith. And while I was trained in psychology at the highest levels, what actually set me free was a spiritual process that rewired everything. It's really my story of spiritual renewal, being met by God in the exact places where psychology just couldn't reach. And I believe emotional freedom is possible, but it's not always in the ways we've been taught. And if you've ever felt like you don't quite fit into the clinical world or the spiritual world either, you're not alone. This episode is for the woman who just feels like she doesn't fit in a box. And let me tell you why I stopped trying to choose between and I started integrating both. Welcome to the Power to Flourish podcast, where science meets the art of a beautiful life. I'm Dr. Andrea Line, positive psychologist, giftedness expert and coach, and modern-day spiritual godmother to brilliant, deep-feeling women. This isn't just another self-help podcast. It's a sanctuary, a sacred space to come back to yourself. Each week, we'll explore the emotional experience of gifted, sensitive women and what it means to live a life that feels as beautiful as it may look. Because flourishing isn't a luxury, it's your birthright, and your life is waiting. This is the Power to Flourish podcast. So, like most Ph.D. level psychologists, I was trained in the standard evidence-based psychology, right? I knew the protocols, the theories, the DSM inside and out. I spent years of my life learning how to diagnose and treat mental illness of all types. But when it came to my own healing, it wasn't the science that saved me. It was faith. And I remember being in the thick of my struggle, just grieving and exhausted and functioning on the outside, unraveling on the inside. And to be honest, I've had moments like this at different points of my life, but at one point in particular, before really the fullness of this spiritual process, I just felt like it was the end part of my 20s going into my 30s, and I had learned all of this stuff. And while much of it was really helpful, and I did learn a lot, and I could apply a lot of it to my life, so it wasn't for nothing. But clearly, nothing I had learned in my training, and even in the moments that I had been in therapy, was really helping me to feel whole. And what shifted everything for me wasn't a method per se. It wasn't a therapeutic process, although again, like I said, I've learned lots of things that I've incorporated different skills and different things into my life, and I'm very grateful for those. But it really was an encounter, which might sound a little out there for some people who aren't quite sure about all of this spiritual stuff, but and to be more honest and to be more like precise, it wasn't just one encounter. It was like a series of encounters and an unfolding that started, I would say, in my early 20s, maybe even a little bit in my teenage years, but really more my early 20s, and then another wave of really intense healing through the spiritual renewal process, I would say, in my early 30s. And then another level of it, right? And it's like we get these opportunities again in my early 40s, and now I'm getting into my late 40s. And look, I am looking forward to, I'm always open to the levels of spiritual renewal and healing that I that I gain from that, because I've learned over all these years and decades and different experiences, with each step into that, there's more wholeness and there's more freedom. And because I've had such a journey and I have had so much to heal from, I'm just so passionate. Again, even outside of just the clinical space, and I worked clinically for a very long time, and now I'm shifting more of my work into integrating the spiritual piece, because it was such a strong and powerful and effective way for me to heal. I want to just be clear that in nothing that I am saying on this episode, I am not trying to discourage anyone from taking a clinical or more traditionally therapeutic approach. If that is working for you, then that's great. And there's nothing wrong with that. I am simply sharing my experience because I think it's unusual, because I do have a PhD in clinical psychology. And I think in spiritual spaces, sometimes people share their experiences, but they don't necessarily have the clinical background. And in my experience, a lot of clinical practitioners don't necessarily see the value, as certainly not in their own life or in clinical practice, to integrate the spiritual. So I'm really sharing this from a place of just offering a different point of view, especially if you're someone who has struggled. Maybe the clinical route just doesn't feel aligned to you. Maybe you're someone who, doesn't want to take psychotropic medications, or maybe you have tried it and you don't like the way it makes you feel, or you've been in therapy for years, or you don't feel like you're making headway. So please understand, I'm speaking to certain people where this resonates, but I don't want anyone to feel like therapy shouldn't be, that therapy is bad or that medication is bad. That's certainly not what I'm trying to say here. But so going back to my journey, in the most simplified terms, I would say I was on a journey where I started having these moments. They were very quiet and they were sacred and they were deeply personal, where I felt, the way I'm going to phrase it, you may use different words, but where I felt the presence of God. And I felt the presence of God in a way that rewired something in me. And I believe that with all of my heart. I believe that that is possible. I believe that is what has happened for me. And I believe that can happen for other people. And it's not like it all happened overnight. Although I do have a story from my teenage years, which I will save and share maybe at another time. And it wasn't just like this magical thing, but it was undeniable. And when I was going, I would say, especially around the age of 30, 31, in that time frame, I was really having some different kinds of encounters, or we could just call them experiences. And not that I didn't have any experiences like that when I was younger, but I think part of the difference for me when I got into my 30s was I had some people close to me who could mentor me and help me make sense of it and take me through a healing journey that was using more of a spiritual approach than a clinical approach. And now understand, this was all happening for me right after I finished my clinical training. So the irony is not lost on me. But at some point after I walked through a lot of it was also heart-wrenching. Healing is often met I just think back on those times, and there were so many tears cried, and they were tears cried for moments that were earlier in my life where I didn't have the safety or the space to do that. But so it was hard, in a certain sense. On the other hand, it was easy because I felt like God was just taking me on a journey and I didn't have to force anything. But there there was a moment that was sort of like a turning point for me. And especially again, at this point, I was doing clinical work. I was doing, traditional therapy, which I was trained to do. And I just realized, God did for me what psychology, what science, what the experts, all this knowledge, all this head knowledge alone could not do for me. So that was my personal turning point. And again, it doesn't mean the science is useless. In fact, I love science. It's why I studied science. I love it. I obviously still teach it. I'm a huge proponent of knowledge, science, all the things. But for me and for many women I meet and speak with and mentor and work with in coaching and in spiritual circles and areas of my life, true healing came when we stopped relying on the formulas and we just started listening to the spirit. That's my terminology for it anyway. You may be coming into this conversation, you may be listening to me, and you may have very different spiritual, religious beliefs than me. And I just want to take a moment right now to say, I am just sharing my own personal experience, and I have no intention of trying to, say to anyone that my way is the right way or anything like that. But I'm just sharing from my heart, and some of this you might connect and resonate with, and some of it you may not, and that's totally, totally fine. We all have our different paths and processes, and again, I'm just sharing from my authentic place. It's all I know, and I think for some women this will make a lot of sense, and it's okay if it doesn't. But I would just ask that you would stay open to the possibility that maybe there's additional ways, it's not, it doesn't have to be either or, but additional ways for healing that don't necessarily happen just like in the therapy office, right? Again, as a therapist, I've sat with so many people and there have been so many beautiful healing moments in a therapy office. So it's not to say that they can't or shouldn't happen there, but it's to say they can happen at any other time. So let's just name that tension, right? Like there are many women, you may be one of them right now listening, who just feel torn between these two worlds, right? We have like all this science, we have all this information, especially today in the podcast and the social media and the blogs and just chat GPT, right? And the knowledge, like you're reading all this stuff. We've got all the vocabulary now. Everyone's talking about these terms that, 10, 15 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, like the mainstream, the average person wasn't discussing things like nervous system regulation or emotional regulation or just mental health issues in general. So, you're sitting in these therapy offices, perhaps, again, nothing against therapy offices, but you may have had experience where you feel like these spaces, I'll say, never acknowledge the fullness of who you are, your soul, right? Or maybe you're in these different spiritual or religious spaces where you feel like your intellect and your questioning, your curiosity and your complexity is not really acknowledged either. And maybe at times, especially if you're a woman, it's seen as a threat. And so you're left wondering and thinking, where do I belong? Where do I belong? And if that's you today, I want you to hear this very clearly. You are likely, as a gifted woman, just too multidimensional to fit into a single box. And it's very normal to be going into these different spaces and feeling like aspects of yourself aren't really being touched upon or mirrored or acknowledged. So your healing pathway, it doesn't have to be clinical or spiritual. It can be both. It can be neither. But most importantly, it can just be yours, right? If you can just allow your path and your process to unfold the way it's meant to. And this is why I created the work I do now, really. I left the traditional clinical therapy setting and model. I no longer work as a quote unquote, a therapist. Obviously, everything I think about and do in a certain sense is therapeutic because that's just the way I think. But I realized several years ago, and it's been an interesting journey for me with all of my training, to make a bold decision to step out of that space. And probably a lot of people would think, oh my gosh, are you crazy? You went to school for so long to learn XYZ, right? But I stopped functioning in the medical model a long time ago. And again, that's another story for another time. But both professionally and personally in my 30s, I was on a journey where I realized this disease model, this medical model that we use, especially in the United States, but mostly in the Western world, was just not in alignment. That's the best way I can put it. It just wasn't in alignment with what I really believed and how I operated and how I wanted to operate. So I have stepped out of that so that I can integrate the science, and especially the science of positive psychology, along with, of course, all my training in clinical psych, but integrating that with the spiritual principles that I've come to learn and know, to work with people on that like soul level and their creativity and the beauty and just all of these different aspects of who we are that I found was just a little harder for me to do in the box of figuring out what the DSM diagnosis is and then treating to that disorder, right? It just for me, I'm just speaking for myself, that was a challenge for me to work like that because of what I believe to be true. So that's a little bit about my framework and how I think about the work today, right? My goal is to honor the depth of our emotions with the tools of psychology, for sure, but also to honor the sacred wisdom that just can't always be explained with data and with the textbooks and with, just with the science. I have seen things happen that defy science, and I'm not going to try to understand it. I just know it's possible. And I'm open to that. I've seen it personally. I've seen it with other people. So for me, true healing is really about restoring wholeness. And that means we're tending to the nervous system and the spirit. We are, perhaps for some people, that means you're not just exploring your trauma, but you're practicing trust and faith and that those spiritual, it's really like ancient spiritual truths. It's about, again, reclaiming your sovereignty, not just through mindset work. It's just not enough. I mean, mindset work is amazing. It's so important. And if you need to do mindset work, by all means, do it. I am constantly working on my mindset to this day, but that is not going to be that's not the full picture, right? It's through embodiment. It's through divine alignment. And I believe that that God is really the one who empowers all the healing that we see in the first place. So why not tap into that? So that's the integration that I work with. And it doesn't mean, if you were to work with me, that you always have to focus on a lot of the spiritual piece. It sort of depends on how much or how little, but that just, to be clear, that is how I think of these things, given my own personal journey and experience. So if you've ever felt, once again, you just don't quite belong in the clinical world or the spiritual world, please know you're not alone. There's a middle path. There's always just this beautiful middle path of integration, and you get to walk it on your own terms because your healing, it doesn't have to be explained by anyone else. It just has to feel like home to you. If this message resonated with you, if you've ever felt caught between science and spirituality or psychology and God, I would love for you to subscribe and share this episode with a friend who might need to hear it. And you can find more of my work and resources at my website. That's AndreaLein.com. And I'm always sharing reflections and little sprinklings of things here and there over on Instagram at Dr. Andrea Lein. And most of all, thank you for being here, for just being curious and for being open to hearing my personal journey, which I don't always share with everyone, but here I am putting it out on a podcast episode for the world to hear. So thank you for just being willing to seek something more beautiful, something that's more integrated and more true and more in alignment with how you're created. And I'll see you next time. Keep flourishing. Thank you for listening to the Power to Flourish podcast. I hope today's conversation left you feeling more seen, more supported, and more deeply connected to yourself. And if this episode resonated, would you take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend? It's one of the best ways to help this work reach the women who need it most. You'll find show notes, links, and resources from today's episode at powertoflourish.com. And now just a quick reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It's not therapy, medical advice, or a substitute for professional support. Listening doesn't make me your therapist or doctor, though if you're looking for a coach, you know where to find me. All right, beautiful one, that's it for now. Until next time, trust yourself, honor your gifts, and keep flourishing.